She stood alone at the altar, white dress, flowers in hand, 400 pairs of eyes watching her fall apart in real time. The groom never showed. When the whispers started spreading like wildfire through the church, when the laughter began, quiet at first, then louder, one man in the back row couldn't sit still anymore. He wasn't her boyfriend. He wasn't her family. He was nobody special, just a guy who couldn't watch someone get destroyed in front of a crowd and do nothing about it. What happened next made national headlines. This is their story. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this one travels. The morning of October 14th started the way most Pittsburgh mornings did in the fall. Gray sky, cold air pushing through the gaps in old windows, the smell of rain that hadn't quite arrived yet hanging over everything like a threat. Landon Hayes was already awake at 5:15. He hadn't set an alarm. He rarely needed one anymore. His body had rewired itself over the past 4 years into something that simply didn't allow for deep sleep, always half listening for the sound of small footsteps in the hallway, always half expecting something to go wrong before sunrise. That was what being a single father did to you. It turned rest into a light doze and called it a night. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling of his bedroom in the apartment on Morrow Street, a 2-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The radiator clicked and hissed in the corner. Outside, a garbage truck groaned down the block. Landon was 32 years old and looked every bit of it, not in a broken-down way, but in the way that a man looks when he's been carrying real weight for real years. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there at 25. His hands were calloused from work, from building things, from the physical labor that came with being a mid-level project architect at a firm that respected his talent but didn't exactly celebrate it. He had dark hair he kept short because he didn't have time to deal with it, and a jaw that was almost always carrying a day or two of stubble, because shaving every morning felt like a luxury he couldn't justify before getting his daughter ready for school. His daughter, Maisie. 6 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with dinosaurs and the color orange, and the single best thing Landon Hayes had ever accidentally done right. She was asleep in the next room, probably sprawled sideways across her bed the way she always did, one arm hanging off the edge, completely unconscious to the world in the way that only children and people with clean consciences can manage. Landon got up quietly. He made coffee, he packed her lunch, he ironed the blue button-down he'd been planning to wear to the wedding that afternoon. Not because he was particularly excited about attending, but because Victoria Sterling was his CEO, and when your CEO gets married, you show up. You wear the blue shirt, you sit in the back, you applaud at the appropriate moments, and you leave before the open bar becomes a problem. That was the plan. He thought about Victoria while the coffee brewed. It would be dishonest to say he'd never thought about her in ways that went beyond professional admiration. She was, and he acknowledged this to himself the way a man acknowledges a fact he has no intention of acting on, extraordinary. Not in the polished, untouchable way that rich and powerful people sometimes seemed extraordinary from a distance. In a more uncomfortable, more specific way. She was sharp in meetings without being cruel about it. She remembered names. She asked follow-up questions. She had once stopped in the middle of a company walkthrough to crouch down and talk to a custodian's daughter who had been brought in because school was canceled, and she'd talked to that little girl like she was the most interesting person in the room. Landon had watched that from across the hallway and thought, well, that's a problem, because Victoria Sterling was engaged to Preston Grant. And Preston Grant was the kind of man who got featured in business magazines. Square jaw, tailored everything. The particular brand of handsome that came from never having missed a meal or worried about a bill in his entire life. He was always at Victoria's events, always with his hand on the small of her back in the photographs, always smiling in a way that Landon couldn't quite read. Not warm, not cold, just practiced. Landon had told himself, repeatedly and firmly, that none of this was his business. He was her employee. She was his employer. There was a chain of command and a professional distance and several very good reasons why a 32-year-old single father who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and drove a 6-year-old Jeep should not spend shit any time thinking about a CEO who was engaged to someone else. He had largely succeeded at this. Mostly. More or less. He got Maisie up at 7. She came stumbling out of her room in her orange pajamas, hair everywhere, dragging her stuffed stegosaurus by one back leg across the floor. She looked up at him with eyes that were half open and deeply unimpressed with the concept of mourning. "Is it Saturday?" she asked. "No, Bug. It's Wednesday." She considered this information. "I don't want it to be Wednesday." "I know. Neither do I." He made her oatmeal with brown sugar, and she sat at the kitchen table looking at it like it had personally offended her, and they ate breakfast together in the quiet companionship that had become the rhythm of their mornings. She talked about a dream she'd had involving a T-Rex in a shopping mall. He listened and asked questions and drank his coffee and felt the particular kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, the kind that sleep doesn't always fix. "You're going to a party today?" Maisie asked, eyeing his ironed shirt, which he draped over the back of a chair. "A wedding." "Whose?" "Someone from work." "Are you going to dance?" "Absolutely not." She thought about this seriously. "You should dance, Daddy. You're good at it when you think no one's watching." He looked at her. "Who told you that?" She smiled, big gap-toothed, utterly without mercy, and went back to her oatmeal. His neighbor, Donna, a retired school librarian who lived in 3B and who had become something between a babysitter and a surrogate grandmother over the past 3 years, came over at noon to watch Maisie while Landon got ready. "You look nice," Donna said when he came out in the blue shirt and his only good blazer. "I look like a man who doesn't own a suit." "Same thing, sometimes." She pressed a travel lint roller into his hand. "There's dog hair on your left shoulder. You don't have a dog." "I know. I don't know where it comes from." Donna sat down on the couch with a level of competence and comfort that suggested she had absolutely no concerns about managing a 6-year-old for an afternoon. Maisie had already climbed onto the couch next to her with 3 books and the Stegosaurus. "Be home by 8, Donna said. "I've got my show." "I'll be home by 6, Landon said. "I'm just going to make an appearance." He meant it when he said it. Sad. The Church of St. Michael on Allegheny Avenue was the kind of place that had been beautiful once, and had maintained enough of that original beauty to still be impressive, even if some of the gilt was flaking and the carpet in the aisle had been replaced one too many times. It seated about 300, but today it felt closer to 400, with additional chairs squeezed into the side aisles and people standing near the back. Preston Grant apparently knew a lot of people. Landon found a seat near the back left, between a woman he didn't recognize in a yellow hat and an older man who had already fallen asleep upright. He loosened his collar slightly and looked around. The flower arrangements were enormous. White roses and something else he couldn't name cascading from every surface. The string quartet in the corner was playing something classical and polished. There were probably more catered floral arrangements in this building right now than Landon had seen in his entire life combined. He found himself looking for the moment he could reasonably leave. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock. By 2:15, people were starting to shift in their seats. The string quartet played their 3rd loop through the same piece. A flower girl near the front started whispering loudly to her mother. The officiant, a man in his 60s in gold vestments, checked something on his wrist and cleared his throat once, softly, into the microphone, which picked it up and sent it bouncing off the stone walls. Victoria hadn't come down the aisle yet. That wasn't unusual. Brides were late sometimes. Everything was fine. By 2:30, it was not fine. The whispers started the way they always do, from the front row working back like a tide going out. People were leaning toward each other. People were looking at their phones. Landon couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could feel the shift in the room. That collective change in posture and energy that happens when a gathering stops being an occasion and starts being a situation. He craned his neck slightly to see past the people in front of him. The groom's side of the church was occupied. Preston's family and friends were all there. His mother in an elaborate pink fascinator, his groomsmen in charcoal suits standing near the front, exchanging glances that said more than their carefully neutral faces intended. But the groom himself was not standing at the altar. Landon checked his watch. 2:38. Where is he? The murmuring got louder. One of the groomsmen walked quickly out a side door and came back 2 minutes later looking like a man who had just received information he did not know how to process. Then the doors at the back of the church opened. Victoria Sterling walked in. She was wearing a gown that probably cost more than Landon's monthly rent. Ivory silk, long, simple, devastatingly elegant in the way that things are when they fit perfectly, and the person inside them is the kind of person the fabric was made to carry. Her hair was up. She was holding a bouquet of white roses tight against her chest. She walked to the edge of the aisle and stopped. The church went from murmuring to near silent. Victoria looked toward the altar, toward the spot where Preston was supposed to be standing, had been standing in rehearsal 2 days ago in every photograph she'd imagined since they got engaged. The officiant was there. 2 groomsmen were there. A small army of flowers was there. Preston was not there. Landon watched her face from across the church, and he would never be able to fully describe what he saw. It wasn't just shock. It wasn't just hurt. It was something more specific. The particular expression of a person who has just had a private fear confirmed publicly, in front of hundreds of witnesses, with nowhere to go and nowhere to hide. Her maid of honor moved toward her quickly, touching her arm, whispering something. Victoria didn't move. Then her phone, tucked into some invisible pocket in the dress, apparently buzzed. She looked at it, and whatever was on that screen made her face go very still, the kind of still that is the opposite of calm. The woman in the yellow hat next to Landon leaned toward her companion and said, in a whisper that carried rather badly, "Is the groom even here?" The old man who had been asleep jolted awake and looked around in confusion. Someone near the middle of the church laughed. It was brief and almost certainly involuntary, the nervous kind, the kind that escapes before a person can stop it. But it was loud enough to be heard. Victoria heard it. Landon saw her chin drop slightly, saw her shoulders, already held so carefully, so precisely, begin to cave just a fraction of an inch. And that was the moment. He didn't make a decision exactly. It was more that he stopped not making one. He stood up. The woman in the yellow hat looked at him. The old man looked at him. Several people nearby turned to look at him with expressions ranging from confusion to mild alarm. Landon Hayes straightened his blazer, stepped out of the pew, and walked down the center aisle of the church toward the woman standing at the front of it, alone. He was aware of the heads turning as he walked. He was aware of the sound of his own shoes on the carpet. He was aware that this was, objectively, one of the stranger things he had ever done in his life, and that there was a significant possibility it was going to go badly. He kept walking. When he reached Victoria, she turned to look at him with an expression that said she had no idea what was happening but was too surprised to retreat. He stopped about 2 feet in front of her, looked at her directly. "Hi," he said. She blinked. "Landon?" "Hey." He glanced once toward the altar, then back at her. "I know this is... I don't know what's happening exactly, but you're standing here by yourself and the whole room is watching, and I thought..." He paused, recalibrated. The speech he'd half-formed in his head while walking down the aisle had already abandoned him. He went with the plain version instead. "I didn't want you to be standing here alone, that's all." For a moment, she just looked at him. Her grip on the bouquet tightened slightly. "You're my architectural project manager," she said. "I am, yeah." "You work in the Bridgeside office. 3rd floor, by the window with the broken blind." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the rigid blankness cracked slightly around the edges. The maid of honor, a sharp-looking woman named Claire, who Landon had met once at a company event, was staring at him with her mouth open. The officiant had stepped back slightly, looking between them with professional uncertainty. 400 people were absolutely silent. Victoria looked at him for another long moment. Then she took one breath, slow and deliberate, squared her shoulders again, fully this time, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "Don't let go of my arm." He offered it, she took it, and they walked together up the aisle to the front of the church. What happened next was something Landon would spend the next year trying to explain to various people, friends, his sister, eventually Maisie, and never quite getting right because the logic of it only made sense inside the moment. It didn't make sense explained. It barely made sense remembered. The officiant, apparently a man of considerable adaptability, leaned toward them quietly and asked in a low voice what they would like to do. Victoria, still holding Landon's arm, still holding her bouquet, said in a steady and clear voice that she would like to proceed with a commitment ceremony. Not the legal wedding. That couldn't happen. Not today, not this way. But a public acknowledgement, something real. The officiant nodded slowly. "I can do that." Claire made a sound that might have been a protest but didn't quite become one. The string quartet, after a moment of consultation among themselves, began to play again. And in a church full of people who had come expecting to see a society wedding and had instead witnessed something neither fully scripted nor fully accidental, Landon Hayes and Victoria Sterling stood at the altar together. He didn't have rings to offer her. He didn't have vows prepared. The officiant spoke in general terms about commitment and presence, and choosing to stand beside someone in moments that weren't planned. Landon stood very straight and tried not to think about the fact that he was the wrong man in the right moment, or possibly the right man in a situation that made no logical sense. Victoria spoke a few words, simple ones. Her voice didn't waver. When it was over, she exhaled, just once, sharply, like something that had been held for a long time, and turned to face the room. The church was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then someone in the third row started clapping, and then the row behind them. And then it moved backward through the room like a wave. Not everyone clapped. Some people looked stunned. Some looked confused. Some were already reaching for their phones. Landon heard someone near the middle say, loudly, "Who is that man?" He didn't know the answer exactly. He wasn't sure he'd known for a while. The reception was held at the Montrose Club because Victoria's event planner had not received any instruction to cancel it and had, operating on professional instinct alone, decided that the safest choice was to keep everything exactly as planned and let the principals make decisions about the rest. It was, as a result, one of the more surreal receptions anyone in Pittsburgh's social circuit could remember attending. The food was extraordinary. The flower arrangements from the church had been duplicated at even greater scale throughout the ballroom. There was a jazz quartet in one corner and a DJ set up in another, neither of which had received instructions about the situation, and both of which had decided to simply begin their respective playlists and see what happened. Victoria arrived at the reception still in her gown, Landon still beside her, Claire approximately 2 steps behind them with the expression of someone managing a crisis with insufficient information. The 200 or so guests who had followed from the church to the reception venue parted slightly as they came through the main entrance, in the way that crowds do when they're not sure what the protocol is. Preston's mother had left the church before the commitment ceremony concluded. Most of Preston's friends had left shortly after. What remained was a crowd that was approximately 70% Victoria's people, and they were looking at her with a combination of concern and something that looked cautiously like admiration. A woman Victoria's age, mid-30s, in a dark green dress, who turned out to be her college roommate, pulled Victoria into a brief fierce hug and then stood back and looked at her. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Victoria said. It came out honest and unguarded in a way that clearly surprised her. The woman, her name was Sophie, looked at Landon, looked back at Victoria. "Who is this?" "He works for me." Sophie blinked. I know. Okay?" Sophie nodded slowly, recalibrating. "Okay. I'm getting you a drink." The evening progressed in the way that evenings under pressure often do. In fragments, not quite linearly, with the whole thing feeling both interminable and oddly condensed. Landon spent most of it standing slightly to the side of things, trying to figure out what his role was now, concluding that he didn't have one in any formal sense, and deciding to simply stay until Victoria indicated one way or another that she was all right. He called Donna at 5:30. "Hey, I might be a little later than planned." A pause. Then, "Is everything okay?" "It's a long story." Another pause. "Is the story on the internet?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Possibly." "Landon." Donna's voice had shifted into the particular register of a 68-year-old woman who had raised 3 children and was not going to be surprised by much. "I saw something on my phone about a wedding and a man walking down an aisle. Was that? Tell Maisie I'll explain when I get home. She's asleep. She went down early. A beat. Take whatever time you need." He thanked her and hung up. Claire appeared at his elbow approximately 30 seconds later. She was holding 2 glasses of water with the efficiency of someone who had been managing complicated situations for a long time. "She wants to talk to you," Claire said. "Okay. She also wants you to know that she's aware this is unusual." "I figured." Claire studied him for a moment with sharp, dark eyes. "Why did you do that? Walk up there." Landon thought about it. The honest answer was that it had felt impossible to sit still. That there was something about watching someone humiliated in public that had tripped a wire in him he hadn't known was there, Something instinctive and fairly non-negotiable. But that didn't fully explain it either. I don't know, he said finally. Claire seemed to find this more satisfying than a prepared answer would have been. She handed him one of the water glasses and walked away. Victoria found him on the terrace about an hour later. She'd changed out of the gown. Claire had apparently had the foresight to bring a change of clothes, and was wearing a dark blue wrap dress that made her look less like a centerpiece and more like a person. She still had her hair partially up. A few pieces had fallen loose around her face. She looked exhausted in a way she probably didn't realize was visible. She came and stood at the railing beside him without preamble. For a moment they were both quiet, looking out at the parking lot and, beyond it, the dark sweep of the river. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. And I need you to answer me honestly, not the way an employee answers their employer. All right. She turned to look at him directly. Did you know I liked you before today? Landon looked at her. The question was more direct than he'd anticipated, and he took a moment to respond to it properly rather than reflexively. No, he said. I didn't know that. She nodded, processing this. I'm not sure I knew it either, fully, which probably says something. She turned back to the parking lot. He texted me, by the way, Preston. It said... She stopped, pressed her lips together. It said he'd met someone who was a better strategic fit. The words sat there. A strategic fit, she repeated quietly, like she was still deciding whether to be furious or devastated about it. I'm sorry, Landon said. I keep trying to figure out when I missed it, what I didn't see, because it feels like I should have seen something. She shook her head slightly. He said things like strategic fit, and I thought that was just how he talked, how business people talked. I thought underneath it he was... She stopped again. I don't know what I thought. Landon didn't say anything. He'd learned, mostly from raising Maisie and partly from years of working with other people, that there were moments when the most useful thing you could do was hold still and let someone talk until they ran out. Victoria looked at him after a moment. You have a daughter. I do. Maisie. He blinked. You know her name? You have a picture of her on your desk, the one with the Halloween costume. The Triceratops. Yes. For the first time all evening, something that was actually close to a smile moved across Victoria's face. She looked very committed to the costume. She spent 3 weeks building the horns out of craft foam. She was extremely committed. He paused. She's 6. Yeah, she's my whole thing. Victoria studied him for a moment. What happened to her mother, if that's... You can ask. I don't want to if it's okay. He told this story enough times that the sharp edges had smoothed down somewhat. Not gone, just worn. We weren't together. Maisie wasn't planned, but she wasn't... It was complicated. Her mother wasn't in a place where she could stay. She left when Maisie was 9 months old. We haven't heard from her in 4 years. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It worked out. He meant it. I mean, it didn't, and then it did. That's usually how things work. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not sympathy exactly, something more considered than either of those. Like she was adding information to something she'd been building for a while without knowing it. I want to ask you something else, she said. And this is even stranger than the first question. Okay? What do we do now? He thought about it honestly. He thought about what made sense logistically, professionally, socially. He thought about the fact that she was his employer and he was her employee, and that they were standing on a terrace after a non-wedding, and that there were probably 50 people inside with smartphones documenting all of this in real time. He thought about Maisie asleep in his apartment, completely unconscious to the world, utterly certain that her father would be there when she woke up. I don't think we have to decide tonight, he said. Victoria exhaled, a long, quiet exhale, like something releasing. No, she said. I suppose we don't. They stood there a while longer, not talking much, looking out at the ordinary darkness of the parking lot and the river beyond it, while the sound of a jazz quartet drifted through the glass doors behind them, and a city that didn't know either of them got on with its evening. He drove home at 9:30. The apartment was quiet. Donna had left a note on the kitchen counter that said she was perfect. I left soup in the fridge. Don't overthink things, followed by 3 small stars she'd drawn in blue pen. Landon stood in the kitchen in his blazer for a moment, reading the note. Then he went and looked in on Maisie. She was exactly as he'd expected, sideways across the bed, arm hanging off the edge, Stegosaurus tucked under her chin, completely gone to the world. The nightlight on her dresser threw a soft orange glow across the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. He thought about Victoria standing at the back of the church with her bouquet and her phone and her careful, crumbling posture. He thought about Donna's note, "Don't overthink things." He turned off the hallway light and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. The radiator clicked. Outside, rain had finally arrived and was running quietly down the window glass. He lay there in the dark and thought about how very strange the day had been, and how completely nothing would be the same after it, and how he had no idea yet whether that was a good thing or not. He suspected, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, that it probably was, but he was going to have to wait and find out. The story broke overnight. By the time Landon woke up Thursday morning, there were 14 missed calls on his phone. 3 from his sister Dana in Cleveland, 2 from coworkers he hadn't spoken to in months, and 9 from numbers he didn't recognize at all. His name was in the headline of at least one local news site. Someone had filmed the walk down the aisle on their phone, posted it to social media sometime around 8 the previous evening, and by morning it had been viewed roughly 400,000 times. He sat on the edge of his bed reading the notifications with the particular blank feeling of a person who has done something that made complete sense in the moment and is now watching the world decide what it means. His phone buzzed again. Dana. He answered it. "Tell me that's you," she said, without greeting. "It's me." Landon. A pause that carried a significant amount of unsaid content. "That's your boss." "I know who she is. You walked down the aisle at her wedding to someone else. The wedding wasn't technically happening at that point. The groom didn't show." "That is not the clarification you think it is." He could hear her moving around, kitchen sounds, the specific clatter of Dana making coffee in the aggressive way she always did when she was processing something. "Are you okay? Is she okay? What actually happened?" "I don't entirely know yet," he said honestly. "Landon, I know. You have a job, you have Maisie. You can't just—" She stopped herself, started again, more carefully. "I'm not saying what you did was wrong. It wasn't. It was actually, I watched the video and I cried a little, which I'm furious about. But you need to think about what comes next here." "I know, Dana. Because she's a CEO and you're, I know what I am." The words came out slightly sharper than he intended. A silence followed. "I'm not saying it like that," Dana said, quieter. "I'm saying it because you've spent 4 years putting your head down and doing the work and not asking for anything, and I don't want to watch you get hurt." Landon exhaled, looked at the ceiling. The radiator was already clicking in the corner. Outside, the rain from the night before had stopped and left everything looking scrubbed and cold. "I hear you," he said. "I'll call you later." He got off the phone and sat with it in his hand for a moment. Then he got up, because Maisie would be awake in 20 minutes and breakfast wasn't going to make itself. She came out of her room at 7:12 in the orange pajamas with the Stegosaurus under one arm, looking, as she always did in the morning, like she had personally survived something difficult and was waiting for the world to acknowledge this. She looked at his face. 6-year-olds, he had learned, were significantly more perceptive than adults gave them credit for. "Did something happen?" she asked. "Something happened yesterday. It was strange, but it's okay." She climbed onto her chair at the kitchen table. "Was it about the wedding?" "Yeah." "Did you dance?" He paused in the middle of cracking eggs. "No." She nodded as though this explained everything. "Did you eat good food?" "There was good food, yes." "Okay." She put the Stegosaurus on the table facing her, apparently for company. "Donna said you were helping someone." "I was trying to." Maisie considered this with the seriousness of someone who understood at a fundamental level that helping people was a real thing that required real effort and sometimes real cost. She'd understood this since she was 4. He didn't know where she'd gotten it. Maybe from him. Maybe she'd just arrived knowing. "Good," she said finally, and picked up her fork. He made scrambled eggs and tried not to think about the 14 missed calls. The 15th one came in at 7:45 while Maisie was eating. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number, but Pittsburgh area code. He let it go to voicemail. By the time he dropped Maisie at school and driven back through morning traffic, there was a text from a number he also didn't have saved. "This is Victoria. I got your number from HR. I hope that's all right. I'd like to talk today if you're available. No pressure either way." He read it twice standing outside his car in the parking lot of the school. No pressure either way. Something about the phrasing felt careful in a way that made sense. She was, he had always understood, extremely precise with language in a professional context. But this didn't feel like a professional context anymore, and the care she'd taken with those 4 words told him something about how she was approaching the morning. He typed back, "I'm available. You pick where." Her response came in under 2 minutes. "Somewhere that isn't in a newspaper. I'll send an address." The address she sent was a coffee place in Lawrenceville he'd walked past a few times but never been inside. One of those narrow, slightly cramped places with mismatched furniture and no corporate logo visible anywhere. The kind of establishment that existed specifically in the gap between neighborhood staple and undiscovered gem. Not the kind of place a CEO typically ended up, which was presumably the point. He got there first, found a table near the back, away from the window, ordered a coffee he didn't really need, sat with it, and waited. She walked in 12 minutes later. She was wearing jeans and a dark gray coat, hair down for the first time he could remember seeing it. No security detail, which surprised him until he remembered that she'd mentioned once in passing at a company meeting that she tried to keep her personal life as separate from the security apparatus as she could manage. She looked tired. Not dramatically tired. She'd clearly slept and made an effort, but the specific tiredness that lives in a person's eyes after a night when they've slept but not rested. He recognized it. He'd worn it for most of the past 4 years. She spotted him, came over, sat down across from him without any of the social preamble that the situation might otherwise have called for. "Hi," she said. "Hey." A waitress came by. Victoria ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. The waitress left. For a moment they just sat there, which was strange and also somehow not as uncomfortable as it should have been. "I want to apologize," Victoria said. Landon looked at her. "For what?" "For the situation I put you in. Last night. The commitment ceremony, the reception, keeping you there. You were trying to do something kind, and I think I—" She stopped. "I used you as a stabilizing object, which isn't fair to you. I stayed because I chose to. You stayed because I asked you not to let go of my arm. I could have let go." She studied him for a moment. "Could you have?" It was a real question, not a rhetorical one, and it caught him slightly off guard. He thought about it honestly. "Probably not," he admitted. "But that's my problem, not yours." The coffee arrived. Victoria wrapped both hands around the mug in the way people do when they need something to hold. "I watched the video this morning," she said. "Someone filmed it. It's been—" "I know, I saw. Most of them are being kind about it, online, which is unusual and temporary, and I've stopped reading the comments." She paused. Preston released a statement. Landon felt something tighten in his chest. What did it say? That he'd made a painful personal decision, that he wished me well, and that he hoped people would respect his privacy. She said it with perfect flat effect, like reading from a document. No mention of the text he sent me. No mention of the other person. Certainly no mention of the phrase strategic fit. "Are you going to say anything publicly? My communications team wants me to. They've drafted 3 versions already." She turned the mug in her hands. "I don't know. I don't know how much of myself I want to put into that particular conversation right now." Landon nodded. He didn't tell her what to do. He understood, in a bone-level way, the instinct to go quiet when things got loud. They talked for a while, not about the wedding directly, or about what it meant, but about the edges of it. She told him that she'd barely slept, that Claire had stayed at her apartment until past midnight making sure she was all right, that she'd eaten half a container of leftover Thai food at 2 a.m, standing at her kitchen counter, which was, she said, probably the most human she'd felt all day. He told her about Dana's call, about Maisie's reaction, which had been, characteristically, to ask whether he'd eaten good food. Victoria laughed at that. A short, real laugh surprised out of her. She sounds like a very sensible person, she said. She is. She's significantly more sensible than I am. That's a low bar given yesterday. He felt the corner of his mouth pull up. That's fair. The coffee shop had filled up around them. Late morning crowd, mostly people with laptops and headphones, nobody paying them any particular attention. Outside, weak autumn sun was starting to come through the clouds. It was the first time Landon had noticed the weather since yesterday. I want to ask you something, Victoria said, and I want you to answer me as yourself, not as my employee. Okay, she looked at him steadily. There was something in her expression that he'd only seen a handful of times in 2 years of working for her. The look she got when she was about to say something she had decided to say, regardless of how it landed. Do you want to know me? She asked. Actually know me. Not whatever this is formally. Just as a person. Landon held her gaze. The question was simple in its language and complicated in everything else. Yeah, he said. I do. She nodded once, like she'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. Then we should probably figure out how to do that without it being a disaster. That would be ideal, yeah. I'm not promising it won't be complicated. I didn't expect it would be. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee mug and drank from it and looked out the window at the street. And Landon did the same. And for a while they just sat in the quiet of the coffee shop while the city moved past them outside the glass, both of them carrying their respective damage carefully, both of them doing the work of deciding what to do with a morning that had arrived unexpectedly and was turning out to be something neither of them had planned for. After a while, Victoria said, I don't actually want to go back to my apartment today. Landon glanced at her. Where do you want to go? She was quiet for a moment. Somewhere that doesn't feel like being managed. He understood that. The penthouse, the security team, Claire checking in every 20 minutes, all of it well-intentioned, all of it suffocating in a particular way when what you actually needed was a ceiling you could stare at and a few hours where nobody was expecting you to process anything in a productive direction. He thought about his apartment. The 2-bedroom on Morrow Street with the clicking radiator and Donna's soup in the refrigerator and Maisie's artwork covering the bottom half of the hallway wall. The broken blind in the 3rd-floor window. It was the opposite of a penthouse in every specific way. He almost didn't say it, then he said it anyway. You could come to my place for a while. It's very not a penthouse, but it's quiet, and nobody will look for you there. Victoria turned to look at him. He couldn't read her expression fully, but she wasn't dismissing it. Your daughter's at school? She asked. Until 3. She was quiet for a moment, then, You're sure? I wouldn't have offered otherwise. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite trust yet, but was possibly the beginning of it. The hesitant, careful thing that shows up before trust arrives. When a person is deciding whether the door in front of them is one they want to open. Okay, she said. She did bring 2 people from her security team, which he'd expected. They rode in a separate car and parked down the block and communicated with Victoria by text, rather than following her inside, which was, she explained in the elevator up to the 3rd floor, the arrangement she used for situations where she needed the coverage but not the presence. Landon unlocked the apartment and pushed the door open and felt, in a brief and involuntary way, the particular self-consciousness of a person who has just invited someone into their space and is seeing it through new eyes. The living room with the worn couch and the pile of Maisie's books on the coffee table. The drawing Maisie had made of a triceratops taped to the wall beside the TV because she'd asked him to put it up, and he hadn't taken it down in 8 months. The kitchen counter with Donna's note still sitting on it, the 3 small blue stars visible from across the room. Victoria walked in and looked around. She didn't say anything for a moment. It's very orange, she said finally. Maisie's favorite color. She has opinions about home decor. I can see that. She was looking at the triceratops drawing. Did she do this? About 8 months ago. I was supposed to move it to her room. It's still there. Victoria looked at it for another moment. Something moved in her face, something quiet and private that she didn't comment on. She sat down on the couch. She didn't take off her coat right away, like she was still giving herself the option of leaving. He went to the kitchen and heated up Donna's soup without asking, because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because doing something useful with his hands felt better than standing there. He came back with 2 bowls, and she'd taken the coat off and was sitting sideways on the couch with her feet tucked up, looking at her phone with the expression of someone who was reading things they didn't want to read but couldn't stop reading. She looked up when he came in. "I made soup," he said. She looked at the bowls. "You made soup." "My neighbor made soup. I heated it up." She accepted the bowl, looked down at it. Lentil soup with something dark and herbed on top, steam rising from it, entirely ordinary and somehow perfect for 10:30 in the morning after the previous 24 hours. "Tell me about her," Victoria said. Maisie. So he did. He talked about her the way he always talked about her when he let himself, not performing, just recounting. The Triceratops Halloween costume that she'd spent 3 weeks engineering from craft foam. The way she'd decided at age 5 that her Stegosaurus stuffed animal was a scientific specimen and should be studied rather than played with. And then the next day had decided it was her best friend and carried it everywhere. The phase she'd gone through at 4, where she'd refused to eat anything that wasn't a shade of orange or yellow. The way she'd handled her first real disappointment, a promised trip to the Natural History Museum that had been canceled because he'd had an emergency at work, which was to go quiet for a while, and then to come find him and say seriously and without drama, "I know you didn't mean to. It's okay. But I'm still a little sad." And how he'd held on to that statement for weeks afterward because it seemed to him to be about as emotionally articulate as any person he'd ever met. Victoria listened to all of it, not politely, actually listened, in the way he'd noticed she did in meetings, where her attention was full and present rather than divided. "She sounds like she's going to be a lot," Victoria said. "She already is a lot, in the best possible way. Did you figure that out on your own, how to raise her?" "Mostly, with a lot of trial and error, with Donna's help, with the internet at 2 in the morning. He paused. "I made a lot of mistakes. I still make a lot of mistakes. She's turning out okay despite that, which I think is that's just who she is." Victoria was quiet for a moment, turning her spoon in the soup. "Preston didn't want children," she said. Not as a complaint, just as a fact she was placing somewhere, figuring out where it went. He was very clear about that early on. I thought I was okay with it. Landon didn't respond to that directly. He let it sit. "I think I was performing being okay with it," she continued, "because the rest of it seemed to work, professionally and socially, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought that was enough to build on. I think I convinced myself it was the same as wanting the same things." "It's not," he said. "No." She picked up her coffee mug, which she'd carried up from the car. "It really isn't." They sat in the quiet for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. That was the thing Landon kept coming back to, Sua. How the silence between them wasn't the tense, performance-adjacent quiet of 2 people who didn't know each other well enough to be silent. It was something else. Something that felt like it had been there longer than the 2 days they'd been occupying it. He didn't say that out loud because it would have sounded like something from a movie. But he noted it. Around noon, Victoria's phone rang and she stepped out onto the small balcony to take it. Claire, from the sound of it, checking in with the particular frequency of someone who had decided she would not be surprised by any further developments this week. Landon washed the soup bowls and tidied the kitchen with the mechanical comfort of routine, and listened to the muffled one-sided conversation floating through the sliding glass door. When she came back in, she looked like she'd been reminded of things. "I have to deal with some things today," she said. "The board they want to call, and the communications team. And Claire thinks I should see a friend of mine who's a therapist." A beat. "Not professionally, just to talk." "That sounds like a reasonable day," Landon said. "It sounds exhausting." She picked up her coat from the couch, then paused, holding it. "I want to ask you something. You keep asking me things. You keep answering honestly. It's unusual." She looked at him with the direct gaze he'd come to understand was just how she looked at things she was taking seriously. "I don't want this to be the only time we do this. Have a conversation like a regular person. I don't know what form it takes. I'm not suggesting anything specific, but I don't want to go back to the professional distance." Landon looked at her steadily. "Then we won't. It might be complicated." "You said that already." "I'm reinforcing it." "Victoria." He waited until she met his eyes. "I heard you the first time." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put on her coat, which she did efficiently and without any particular ceremony. "I'll text you," she said. "Okay." She walked toward the door, stopped at the hallway, looking at the lower section of the wall where Maisie's artwork was taped up in various stages of artistic development. Dinosaurs mostly, in orange crayon, interspersed with what appeared to be portraits of their family unit. Landon, large and stick-figured. Donna, with a crown for some reason. A figure that was presumably Maisie herself, riding a dinosaur. Victoria looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then she opened the front door and left. Landon stood in his kitchen and listened to the elevator doors open and close down the hall. He looked at Maisie's drawings on the wall, at the Triceratops drawing by the TV, at Donna's note on the counter with the 3 blue stars. He stood there for a while, doing nothing in particular, which was unusual for him. He generally didn't allow himself the luxury of doing nothing. There was always something to get to, something to prepare for, some next thing requiring forward momentum. But for a few minutes he stood in the kitchen on Morrow Street and let himself feel, without categorizing or managing it, the strange, uncertain, not quite explicable sense that something had shifted, that the careful arrangement he'd built over 4 years, the job, the apartment, the routines, the professional distance from anything that might complicate things, had developed a crack. Not a catastrophic crack, just a crack. The kind that lets light in or lets things out depending on which way you were looking at it. He was still figuring out which direction he was looking. His phone buzzed at 12:45. A text from Victoria. "Thank you for the soup and the wall." He typed back, "Maisie will be pleased her art has a new audience." A pause. Then, "Tell her the Triceratops is excellent. The scale is accurate." He looked at that message for a moment and felt something simple and unguarded move through his chest. He put his phone in his pocket, got his jacket, and went to pick up his daughter from school. The afternoon was ordinary in the way only afternoons with a 6-year-old can be. Homework at the kitchen table, a minor disagreement about whether dinosaurs could theoretically be pets, dinner that involved more negotiation than a reasonable person would expect from a meal consisting primarily of pasta. Maisie asked twice more about the wedding, obliquely, and he answered honestly in the age-appropriate version. Someone had been hurt and sad, and he tried to help, and sometimes that was the right thing to do even when it was strange. "Was she okay?" Maisie asked, twirling pasta on her fork. "She's getting there." "Did she eat food?" "She had soup." Maisie nodded, satisfied. "Good. Food helps." He agreed that it did. After Maisie went to sleep, Landon sat on the couch in the quiet apartment and let himself sit with the full weight of the previous 36 hours for the first time since they'd happened. The video. Dana's call. The coffee shop. Victoria on his couch with her coat still on, turning her spoon in the bowl. The way she'd stopped at Maisie's drawings on the way out the door. He wasn't going to rush it. That much he knew. Whatever this was or was going to be, it needed to move at the pace that things moved when they were actually real, not accelerated by circumstance or compressed by the pressure of being watched. He and Victoria were strangers who had spent an extraordinary day together. That was the true version. Everything else was still ahead of them, and it would be messy, and he was a single father with a complicated job and a modest apartment, and she was a CEO who was currently trending online, and none of the math on paper suggested this was simple. But he'd stopped doing things because they were simple a long time ago. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. The radiator clicked. Outside, the street was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the building, a dog barked once and stopped. Landon Hayes lay in the dark and thought about what his neighbor had written on a notepad with a blue pen. "Don't overthink things." He tried. The text started small. That was the thing about it. There was no dramatic declaration, no obvious moment where one thing became another thing. It happened the way most real things happen, which is incrementally and without announcement, through a series of small exchanges that didn't individually mean much, but collectively added up to something neither of them had named yet. 3 days after the coffee shop, Victoria texted him a photo of a building she'd passed on the way to a meeting. An old warehouse in the Strip District with original brickwork and arched windows, partially converted, partially abandoned. "Structurally interesting or structurally terrifying?" she wrote. He studied the photo for a moment. "Both," he wrote back. "The east facade is salvageable. The roof is probably a different conversation." A pause. Then, "How can you tell from a photo?" "Experience." And the way the brickwork is separating at the parapet. See the diagonal crack at the upper right corner? Another pause, longer. I see it now. I walk past this building twice a week for 2 years and never looked at it. Most people don't, he wrote. Buildings are background until someone points out they're not. She sent back a single period, which he interpreted, correctly, as it turned out, as her version of saying something she didn't have words for yet. That exchange lasted 11 minutes and did something to him that he spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to examine too closely. The week after that, she asked if he was free for lunch. Not coffee this time. Lunch, at a place she'd found that wasn't on any food blogger's radar yet. A small Filipino restaurant in Bloomfield run by a woman named Cora who had been cooking out of the same kitchen for 23 years. Victoria had found it by taking a wrong turn on a run. She'd gone back twice before she mentioned it to anyone. They ate at a small table in the back while Cora's daughter brought out food without being asked. Dishes that arrived in no particular order but made complete sense together. And they talked for 2 hours. Not about the wedding, not about Preston, not about what was or wasn't happening between them. They talked about architecture and the specific grief of watching old buildings get demolished for parking structures. They talked about the way her company had grown faster than she'd anticipated, and the particular loneliness of being the person everyone looked to for the answer when you weren't always certain you had one. She told him about growing up in Columbus, the daughter of an engineer father, and a mother who taught high school literature and argued about books at the dinner table like it was a competitive sport. He told her about growing up in Braddock, 20 minutes outside Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood that had more empty lots than occupied ones by the time he was in high school, and how he'd spent his teenage years drawing buildings. Not the buildings that were there, but the buildings that could have been, should have been, if somebody had cared enough. "Is that why you became an architect?" she asked. "Partly." He turned his fork over in his hand. "Partly I became an architect because it felt like something concrete, something you could point to and say, that exists because of work that got done. I need that. I need to see the thing." "You're not a theoretical person." "No." "Are you?" She thought about it. "I used to think I was. I spent a lot of time in business school building models for how things should work. And then I started actually running a company and realized models are a starting point at best." She picked up her water glass. Preston liked models. He liked projections and forecasts and scenarios. He was very comfortable with things that didn't exist yet and less comfortable with things that did. It was the first time she'd brought Preston up unprompted since the day at Landon's apartment. He noticed she said it without the controlled flatness she'd used before, less like reading from a document, more like a person who had started to get some distance on something and was testing whether it had moved. "Are you doing okay?" he asked. "Actually?" She looked at him. "Define okay. Like, are you sleeping? Are you eating food that isn't consumed standing at a kitchen counter at 2 in the morning? The corner of her mouth moved. "Mostly. The standing at the counter thing still happens, but I've upgraded to an actual plate." "That's progress. Claire thinks I'm doing better than I am. My therapist," the friend Claire suggested, "thinks I'm doing worse than I think I am. The truth is probably somewhere between them." She looked at her food. "I don't think I'm heartbroken. I think I'm angry, and I think the anger is covering something else that I haven't figured out yet." "Like what?" "Like the question of how I missed it. How I was with someone for 2 years and didn't know who he was." A pause. "Or maybe I did know, somewhere, which is harder." Landon didn't say anything immediately. He let it land. "I think," he said finally, "that people know things they're not ready to know all the time. It's not a character flaw. It's just, you can only see what you're ready to look at." She regarded him with the particular expression she got when she was deciding whether something was true or just well phrased. Then she nodded, slowly, like she was filing it somewhere she'd come back to. "You're easier to talk to than most people," she said. "You're easier to talk to than you think you are." She gave him a slightly skeptical look. "I'm serious," he said. "You've got a reputation at the company for being, I don't mean this badly, difficult to read. People find you intimidating. The associates especially." "I know," she said. It wasn't false modesty or genuine surprise, just an acknowledgement. "You're not, though. Intimidating. You're exact. You say what you mean, and you mean what you say, and that reads as intimidating to people who are used to a lot of buffer." She was quiet for a moment. Preston said I was cold. The words dropped into the middle of the table with unexpected weight. He said it like a diagnosis, she continued, like I was something to be corrected. Early on, I adjusted. I worked at being warmer in the ways he wanted. And then I'd catch him looking at me sometimes and realize it was never going to be enough. And I never understood why. A pause. Now I think I was just being the wrong version of warm for the wrong person. Landon looked at her across the table. The afternoon light came through the small window beside them, and she was looking at her plate. And she didn't look like a CEO right now. She looked like a person sorting through a box of things that had been in a closet a long time, deciding what to keep and what to let go. "You're not cold," he said. It came out more direct than he intended. "I don't know who told you that first, but they were wrong." She looked up at him. "You're careful," he said. "There's a difference." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite gratitude, not quite relief, but the look of a person who has just heard something true said without agenda. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, picked up his fork. They went back to eating, and Cora's daughter brought out something sweet for dessert that nobody had ordered but both of them ate. The weeks after that moved in a way that felt different from the weeks before. Not faster exactly, but denser. Like time was carrying more in each day. Victoria started appearing in Landon's life in ways that were small and specific rather than dramatic. A text about a structural detail she'd noticed on a walk, a question about which neighborhood was worth looking at for a satellite office location, occasional lunch at Cora's, which became a regular thing rather than a notable thing. She came to the Morrow Street apartment for the second time on a Sunday afternoon in November, about 3 weeks after the first visit. Landon had warned her that Maisie would be there this time. "I know," Victoria said. "That's fine. Maisie is a lot. You've told me. I'm looking forward to it. You say that now." She arrived at 2, carrying a bag from a bakery that contained, as it turned out, exactly the kind of pastries that a 6-year-old would consider optimal, which Landon suspected was not accidental. Maisie opened the door. He'd let her because she'd been asking to be the one to open the door for the past 20 minutes, and looked up at Victoria with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has not yet learned to perform social niceties. "You're the lady from Daddy's work," Maisie said. "I am," Victoria said. "You're Maisie." "Yes." A pause. "Why is your hair so long?" "Maisie," Landon said. "It's a real question." "I just haven't cut it," Victoria said, entirely unfazed, crouching down to Maisie's level in a way that was not self-conscious or performed. "I keep meaning to and then forgetting." Maisie considered this with great seriousness. "I forgot to cut mine too, and then it got tangles, and Daddy had to use the special comb." "The special comb sounds important." "It is. It has a fish on it." Maisie looked at the bakery bag. "Is that for us?" "Maisie," Landon said again. "It is," Victoria said, standing back up. "I didn't know what you liked, so I got a few different things." "I like everything except coconut." I checked. No coconut. Maisie looked at her father with an expression that clearly communicated that this woman had done the necessary research and should be allowed inside. Landon stepped back from the door. The afternoon went the way afternoons with Maisie tended to go, which was in whatever direction Maisie decided they were going. She determined within the first 15 minutes that Victoria needed to be shown her dinosaur collection, which lived on a shelf in her room organized by geological period, a system Landon had helped her establish, and which she maintained with scholarly dedication. Victoria sat on the edge of Maisie's bed and let herself be guided through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous with the attentiveness of a person who was genuinely interested rather than tolerating a child. "This is a Spinosaurus," Maisie said, holding up a green plastic figure. "It's bigger than a T-Rex. Most people don't know that." "I didn't know that," Victoria said. "Most adults don't." Maisie set it down carefully. "Daddy knew, but only because I told him." "That's how most learning works," Victoria said. Maisie looked at her with renewed approval. "Do you know about dinosaurs?" "Not much. I know what I've learned from you in the last 10 minutes. I can teach you more. I'd like that." Landon stood in the doorway of his daughter's room and watched the two of them sitting on the edge of the small bed surrounded by plastic dinosaurs and felt something in the region of his chest do a thing he wasn't fully prepared for. something that was partly wonder and partly terror in roughly equal measure, the specific combination that tends to accompany things that matter. He went to the kitchen and made coffee before his face did anything he'd have to explain. Later, after Maisie had extracted a promise from Victoria to return and continue her paleontology education, they sat in the living room while Maisie watched a nature documentary in her room, and they drank coffee, and Landon looked at Victoria and said, "I'm going to ask you something." "You keep asking me things too," she said. "It's reciprocal, apparently." He set his mug down. "Are you doing this because of what happened? The wedding, the video?" "Because I was there at a particular moment and He stopped. "I need to know if I'm a thing that happened to you and you're processing it, because I need to be honest with you about something." She looked at him steadily. "Say the honest thing." "Maisie is in the next room." He glanced briefly in the direction of her room, then back at Victoria. "She's 6. She doesn't have a mother. She attaches to people who are around her with no filter and no protection because that's what kids do. And I can't introduce someone into her world and have it be temporary. I can't do that to her. So I need to know what you're..." He stopped again, tried again. "I need to know if you're here." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for the right answer to give him, but the silence of someone taking a question seriously. "I'm here," she said, "but I have to be honest back." She held his gaze. "I'm not certain of things the way I want to be. I was certain of Preston, and I was wrong. I don't trust my certainty right now. I'm working on that." A beat. "But I'm not processing. I'm not here because of the moment or the video or the fact that you showed up when something happened. I'm here because I've been watching you for 2 years, and I knew who you were before the church. The church was it was the thing that gave me a reason to stop pretending I didn't." The apartment was quiet. From Maisie's room came the low murmur of a narrator explaining something about the Cretaceous extinction. "Okay," Landon said. "Okay?" Victoria repeated. "Yeah, okay." He picked his coffee back up. "That's enough to go on." She looked at him with an expression that had several things in it. Relief, maybe, and something wary, and something else he could not name, but recognized as the particular openness of a person who is deciding to be less defended and is not entirely comfortable with it yet. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" she said. "I wasn't planning to, no." "Good," she said, and drank her coffee. The 2 months that followed were not a montage. They were not easy or uncomplicated or unmarked by the ordinary friction of 2 people from genuinely different worlds trying to figure out where they fit together. There were evenings when Landon arrived at a dinner Victoria had organized and felt, acutely and without being able to hide it well, the way his blazer sat differently than the jackets around him, the way his vocabulary shifted in certain company, the particular self-consciousness of a person who grew up in Braddock, attending parties in Shadyside. He never said this directly. She noticed anyway. "You get quiet in those rooms," she said to him one night, driving back from a fundraiser he'd accompanied her to as a friend, which was still the working definition for what they were. The city moved past the car windows in amber and white. "I'm fine in those rooms," he said. "You go somewhere else," she said. "In your head. You're physically there and then you're not." He was quiet for a moment. "I grew up differently than those people." "I know. It's not..." He tried to find the accurate version of it. "It's not insecurity exactly. It's more like I'm aware, in those rooms, of the distance between where I started and where I'm standing. And it's not a bad awareness, but it takes up space." She looked out the window. "My father grew up with nothing. His parents were immigrants. He used to tell me about the first time he went to a business dinner early in his career and didn't know which fork to use and how it felt." She paused. "He said the trick wasn't pretending the distance wasn't there. It was just deciding it didn't have veto power." Landon looked at her. She was still looking out the window. "He sounds like a smart man," he said. "He was. He died when I was 24. Heart attack, which was sudden and awful." A pause. "He would have liked you. He had very little patience for people who were comfortable without having earned it." Landon didn't say anything. He drove and thought about a man he'd never met who had sat at a dinner table not knowing which fork to use and had decided it didn't get to define him. The thing with Maisie was, in some ways, the more complicated variable. She loved Victoria with the uncomplicated totality of a 6-year-old who had decided someone was good people and saw no reason to qualify that. By December, she was asking when Victoria was coming over with the same frequency she asked what was for dinner. Not urgently, just as a feature of the expected landscape of her week. She had begun calling her Vic, which Victoria had not corrected, and which Landon had watched her receive the first time with an expression he'd had to look away from because it was too private to witness. But children's love is also a kind of pressure, because it is unconditional in a way that makes the conditions adults carry around with them feel heavier by contrast. Landon felt this. He suspected Victoria felt it too. One evening in December, after Maisie had gone to bed, Victoria was helping him do dishes, something she'd started doing not because he'd asked, but because she'd noticed it needed doing, and she didn't like sitting while someone else worked. And she said, without looking at him, hands in the soapy water, "I'm scared of this." He was drying a pot. He put it down. Of what specifically? Of letting her get attached, of getting attached myself. She scrubbed at a pan that was already clean. I keep waiting for the thing that's going to make me realize I've misread this entirely. Because I've done that before. I'm good at it. You're not misreading this? You can't know that. No, he agreed. I can't guarantee it. But I know you. More than I knew you 2 months ago, and more than you knew yourself then. And I think you've been so busy worrying about whether you're making a mistake that you haven't noticed you're not actually making one. She stopped scrubbing, looked at him. That might be the most confident thing you've ever said to me, she said. I have my moments. She looked at him for a long moment, water dripping from her hands. Then she turned back to the sink, but something had shifted in her posture. Something that had been held released slightly, like a breath let out. Okay, she said, quietly, to the sink. He picked up the pot again and dried it, and they did the rest of the dishes without talking, and it was, in its own ordinary way, one of the more intimate hours he could remember sharing with another person. The professional dimension complicated itself in January when a project Landon had been working on for 8 months. A mixed-use development in the North Shore, the most significant work of his career to date, came up before the board for approval. He presented it himself, which he'd done before for smaller projects. But this one was different in scale and in what it meant, and everyone at the table knew he was in a relationship with the CEO, even if they hadn't been told directly. He presented it straight. No special treatment asked for and none received. Victoria sat at the head of the table and looked at his renderings and his structural analysis and his budget projections with the same rigorous attention she gave everything. She asked him 3 questions that were pointed and hard and that he answered clearly. She did not look at him like a person she was sleeping with because they were not yet sleeping together, which was its own separate fact he carried around with him daily, and she did not look at him like she was managing a delicate situation. She looked at him like he was an architect who had presented a serious project to her board. The project was approved by a 4-2 vote, with both dissenting votes citing budget concerns that Landon largely agreed were legitimate. Afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, Claire appeared beside him with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a woman who had seen a significant amount and chose her words carefully. "Nice presentation," she said. "Thank you. For what it's worth. And I want to be clear that this is my personal opinion and not a reflection of any official company position. I think you're good for her." She handed him one of the coffees. "She laughs differently now." Landon looked at her. Differently how? Like she's actually surprised by it. Claire took a sip of her own coffee. "She used to laugh at the right moments. Now she laughs when something is actually funny." She glanced toward the conference room door. "Don't make me regret saying that." He told her he wouldn't. The first time Maisie called Victoria something other than Vic was in February. It was accidental. The kind of thing that comes out of a child before she knows she's said it. Not as a statement, but as pure instinct. They were at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, doing a puzzle that Maisie had been working on for a week, but that required, she had decided, an adult assist for the sky section, which was 400 pieces of nearly identical blue. Victoria was handling the sky. Landon was handling the border. Maisie was supervising both of them and occasionally contributing a piece she'd been holding for unknown strategic reasons. She reached across the table for a piece and knocked over her cup of water, which went across the puzzle and soaked about a third of the border section and made her gasp with genuine dismay. Victoria caught the cup before it could roll off the table and said, Hey, it's okay. At the same time, she was reaching for the paper towels on the counter, moving quickly without drama, and Maisie watched her fixing it and said, without thinking, without weight, just as the thing that came out of her mouth in a moment of distress looking for comfort, Mom. The word landed in the kitchen the way words sometimes do when they are said for the first time, with a weight disproportionate to their size. Maisie went still immediately, looking at the table, seeming to understand on some level that she'd said something significant without knowing what it meant yet. Landon didn't move. Victoria had the paper towels. She was mopping up the water. She did not react dramatically. She did not freeze or cry or make a moment of it. She just kept cleaning up the water and then looked at Maisie with a steady and completely genuine expression. "It's okay," she said again. "Really. Look, the puzzle pieces are okay. Most of them." She held up a damp edge piece. "This one's maybe done." Maisie examined the piece. "Can we tape it?" "We can try." Maisie slid off her chair and went to find tape, which was in the junk drawer, which she knew because she had explored every drawer in this apartment exhaustively. Landon looked at Victoria across the table. She was looking at the wet puzzle pieces. Her jaw was set in a way that meant she was managing something. "Hey," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "You okay?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment, and then something happened to her face. Not dramatic, not a production, just a quiet crumbling of the things she'd been holding, and she pressed her lips together and nodded once, which was not entirely convincing, and said, "Yeah." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held on, not hard, just contact, just present. Maisie came back with the tape. "I found the whole roll," she announced, holding it up. "We can fix everything with this much tape." "Sounds about right," Landon said. Victoria laughed. The surprised kind, just the kind that Claire had been talking about in the hallway. And Maisie looked at her, pleased to have produced this result, and climbed back onto her chair and got to work on the soggy puzzle piece with the seriousness of a person who had decided that fixable problems deserved to be fixed. The three of them sat at the kitchen table under the kitchen light in the apartment on Morrow Street, with the broken blind in the third-floor window and the Triceratops drawing still on the living room wall and the radiator clicking in the corner. And outside, the city kept going about its business like it always did, and inside that ordinary room, something was quietly, stubbornly, imperfectly becoming real. Preston Grant returned on a Tuesday in April, which was, in Landon's experience, exactly the kind of day that blindsided you. Not a Friday when you were braced for things, not a Monday when you were already in the posture of dealing with problems, but a Tuesday when the week had just found its rhythm and you had stopped watching the door. Landon found out the way he found out most things that weren't meant for him directly, through Claire, who appeared in the doorway of his office at the Bridgeside building at 10:40 in the morning with a coffee she hadn't brought for herself and an expression that said she was delivering information she wished she didn't have. She put the coffee on his desk without being asked. "Preston Grant is back in Pittsburgh," she said. Landon looked up from the structural drawing spread across his drafting table. He held Claire's gaze for a moment, reading her face. Claire's face, in his experience, never overstated things. "When?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "He flew in yesterday. He's been calling her office since this morning." Claire sat down in the chair across from his desk, uninvited, which meant this was not a brief conversation. "He hasn't gotten through to her directly. Her assistant is running interference. But he emailed her personal address, which he still has, and she read it." "What did it say?" "She didn't show me. She told me about it." Claire set her own coffee down. "She said it was an apology, that he'd made a mistake and he knew it, and he wanted the opportunity to say so in person." Landon turned his pen over in his hand, looked at his drawings. They were plans for the second phase of the North Shore development, a residential component, 42 units, the most complex thing he'd ever designed. He'd been staring at the load-bearing calculations for the past hour. "Is she going to see him?" he asked. "She hasn't decided." Claire paused. "She's going to tell you herself. I'm giving you the geometry of the situation so you have it." He nodded, appreciated it. After Claire left, he sat at his drafting table for a while and didn't look at the drawings. He looked at the window, the one with the broken blind that had been broken since before he started working at this company and would probably be broken after he left, and thought about Preston Grant flying into Pittsburgh on a Monday. He tried to be honest with himself about what he was feeling, not the performed version of what he should feel, unconcerned, secure, unbothered, but the actual version. The actual version was a specific low-grade tension in his chest, the kind that came not from fear exactly, but from the awareness that something you'd been careful with was now in a room with a variable you couldn't control. He and Victoria had been together, officially, since January. The transition from whatever they were to something with a defined shape had happened without ceremony. She'd come over one evening, Maisie had been in bed, and they'd been sitting on the couch talking, and at some point the talking had stopped, and there was a different kind of quiet, and Victoria had looked at him and said, "I've been patient enough." And he'd said, "Yeah, so have I." And that was that. It wasn't perfect. It was real, which is better and harder. She was at his apartment most weekends, and he'd been to hers twice, both times feeling the way he always felt in her space. Not unwelcome, but aware of the square footage, the view, the distance between Shadyside and Morrow Street rendered in marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows. He was working on that awareness, making it smaller. Donna's voice in his head. Don't overthink things. But the work they'd done to get here, the careful, patient, imperfect work, felt suddenly like something that could be complicated by a man with a square jaw and a practiced smile getting on a plane from wherever he'd been. Victoria called at noon. "Claire told you," she said when he answered. She thought I should know the geography. "I'm not going to see him. You don't have to explain your decisions to me. I know I don't. I'm telling you because I want to." A pause. "He wants to meet. He says he has things he needs to say. His email was—" She stopped. It was well written, which I'm choosing not to read too much into because Preston was always good at written communication. "What did it make you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. "Tired. Mostly just tired." Another pause. "And something else that I haven't sorted out. Something that it's not what you might think. It's not longing or doubt. It's more like," she searched for it, "like being handed a bill for something you already paid." Landon understood that exactly. "Can you come over tonight?" he asked. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I'll bring food." She came at 7 with Thai from the place on Penn Avenue, and Maisie ate pad Thai with enormous enthusiasm and told Victoria about a presentation she'd done at school about the Jurassic period that had received what she described as a standing ovation, which Landon privately estimated was probably 2 kids clapping and the teacher smiling, but which Maisie had experienced as a standing ovation, and that was what mattered. After Maisie went to bed, they sat on the couch with the remainder of the Thai food between them. And Victoria was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. There was something in it, not distance, but weight. "Tell me about the email," Landon said. She looked at the takeout container in her hand. He said the last 6 months made him realize what he'd thrown away. He said the woman he'd left for, the strategic fit, had been a mistake that he'd recognized quickly, but that his pride had prevented him from admitting. He said he'd watched from a distance as I'd... She stopped. Started again. He said he'd watched me build something real and that he understood now what real actually looked like. A silence. "He meant us," Landon said. "Yes." "He watched the news coverage." "Almost certainly." She set the takeout container on the coffee table. "He also said that he thought I was making a decision based on gratitude rather than genuine feeling, that I was, his phrase, emotionally attached to the gesture rather than the person." There it was. Landon didn't react immediately. He sat with it, turned it over. The accusation was constructed well. It targeted the thing most likely to create doubt, the question he himself had asked Victoria months ago in the coffee shop, now being weaponized by someone who understood her well enough to know where to aim. "What did you think when you read that?" he asked. Victoria looked at him directly. "I thought, Preston has never understood the difference between the cause of a thing and the thing itself." She held his gaze. "You were there on the worst day of my life. That's the cause. The fact that I know you, actually know you, the real version, not the professional version or the version you perform for difficult rooms. That's the thing. They're not the same." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually know it, Not just tell me you know it. He looked at her, at the tiredness in her face and the steadiness underneath it. The quality he'd come to understand was her fundamental nature. Not cold, never cold, just solid in a way that didn't require external validation to hold its shape. I know it, he said. I'm not worried about where this came from. I'm worried about what he does next. Why? Because he didn't come back for an apology. People who come back just to apologize send a letter. They don't fly in on a Monday and start calling your office. Victoria was quiet. He could see her turning this over, the same way she turned every problem over, methodically, without rushing the conclusion. You think he wants something, she said. I think he looked at the news coverage and did some math. The company's valuation. It's gone up significantly in the past 6 months. He watched her face. You know this better than I do. She nodded slowly. She did know it. The quarter after the wedding had been, by some metrics, the best in the company's history. Attention, ironically, had driven business, and Victoria had converted that attention into partnerships and contracts with the kind of efficiency that made the board look very pleased and several competitors very uncomfortable. He told a journalist from the Tribune that he wished me well, she said, 3 days after it happened. Very gracious, very measured. Her jaw tightened slightly. His PR team drafted it. I know his PR person. Did the journalist ask about the text? No one published the text. I never told anyone what it said. Only Claire knows. She paused. And you? He nodded. So publicly, he's the man who made a mistake and walked away gracefully, she said. And privately, he's... She pressed her lips together. Back, Landon said. Back, she exhaled. I don't want to see him, but I also know that not seeing him doesn't make him stop being a factor. He's connected enough in this city that if he decides to... She shook her head. I don't want to be managed by someone who's not in the room. He understood the logic. It was the same logic she applied to business problems. The threat you didn't address directly was the one that had the most room to maneuver. What are you going to do? He asked. I think I need to meet with him once, on my terms, in a controlled setting with Claire present. She looked at Landon, and I need you to trust me to handle it. I trust you completely, he said. That was never in question. She looked at him for a moment, like she was checking the truth of it. He let her look. Okay, she said. He pulled her closer on the couch. She leaned into him, which she did now with the practiced ease of something that had become natural through repetition, and they sat there in the quiet of the apartment with the sound of Maisie's sound machine running softly down the hall and the city outside doing what it always did. The meeting with Preston happened 4 days later, on a Saturday morning at a neutral location, a conference room in a hotel downtown that Claire had booked under a corporate account. Landon was not there. He spent the morning with Maisie at the Carnegie Science Center, standing in front of an exhibit about plate tectonics, while she explained continental drift to him with the authority of a person who had recently read a library book on the subject and considered herself an expert. His phone was in his pocket. He did not check it. Are you listening? Maisie asked. I'm listening. The plates move about as fast as fingernails grow. She looked at him with the expression of a child who has caught a parent getting the information right for the wrong reasons. You read that on the sign. I also heard it from you. You read the sign first. The sign was informative. She considered whether this was acceptable. Decided it was. The Pacific Plate is the biggest, she continued, and it's going under North America, which means eventually California. I was going to say that. Sorry, continue. She continued at length about tectonic subduction, and he listened with genuine attention and felt, in the particular way he felt things at this point in his life, the precise value of this morning, of being here, in this building, with his daughter explaining the movement of the Earth's crust to him, while the rest of it sorted itself out without him. He didn't hear from Victoria until 2:30. The text said, "Done. Call you later." He texted back, "Okay. We're learning about plate tectonics." A pause. Then, "Ask Maisie about the Farallon plate. She'll be delighted." He looked at that for a moment and felt the tightness in his chest ease by several degrees. He asked Maisie about the Farallon plate. She was, as predicted, extremely delighted to be asked. Victoria called at 6 after Maisie was in bed. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Preston had arrived on time, which surprised her. He had a historical relationship with lateness as a power move, and his punctuality suggested either genuine contrition or very good coaching. Claire sat beside her. He sat across from them with no one on his side of the table, which was also a choice. He apologized. It was, Victoria said, a real apology. Not the managed public version, not the email version, but the uncomfortable, halting, face-to-face version that cost something. He said he had chosen the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, and that he had understood this more clearly as time passed. He said the woman he'd left for had been, as he'd written, a mistake, a business alliance that had presented itself as something personal and turned out to be neither. He said he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for the relationship back. Then he said the other thing. He told me, Victoria said, her voice level, that he had been in contact with 2 members of my board. Landon went still. Which 2? Hartwell and Meade. A pause. He suggested to them that my current, his word was entanglement, with an employee presented a governance risk, that it could affect the company's credibility with potential institutional investors, that they should consider whether my judgment was sound. The words sat in the phone line between them. He did this before the meeting, Victoria said. The meeting was... I think he came because he wanted to see my reaction when he told me. He wanted to see if it landed. Did it land? I didn't give him anything. Her voice was flat and controlled in the way it got when she was managing something by will. I thanked him for the apology, told him I accepted it for what it was worth, and ended the meeting. A silence. Hartwell and Meade, Landon said. They haven't said anything to me directly yet. Claire is monitoring. A pause. Hartwell is old money and old ideas and has had reservations about several of my decisions over the past year, none of which have turned out to be wrong. Meade I'm less sure about. He's newer. He might just be susceptible to the framing. The framing being that you're compromised. The framing being that a CEO who is in a relationship with a mid-level employee is not exercising appropriate professional judgment. Her voice stayed steady. Preston is smart enough to know that the relationship itself isn't the issue. It's the optics. It's giving cautious people a handle to grab. Landon said nothing for a moment. He was sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark, the lamp off, city light coming through the window. This is what I was afraid of, he said, not accusatorially, just as a fact being named. I know. Not the relationship, not us, but this. He stopped. I'm an employee, Victoria. I work for your company. Whatever we are personally, professionally, that's the fact, and it was always the thing someone could use if they wanted to. Landon, I'm not going anywhere, he said, clearly and immediately. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying this to give you an exit. I'm saying that Preston found the seam and pushed on it, and now we have to deal with that honestly. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing. I've been thinking about that seam for 4 months, she said. Since January. I know it's there. I've been waiting for someone to use it because I knew eventually someone would. What do you want to do? I want to not let Preston Grant define the terms of my professional life any more than he defined the terms of my personal one. Her voice had found its edge. Not anger, but something colder and more purposeful than anger. Hartwell and Meade are going to hear from me before the end of the week. Not defensively, proactively, on my terms. And the governance question? A pause. That's more complicated. There are rules about relationships with direct reports. You're not my direct report. You're 2 levels removed. Your work goes through the project directors before it reaches me. But the optics are real, he said. Real, she agreed. He leaned back against the wall. Outside, a car passed on Morrow Street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. I can look at other firms, he said. It cost something to say it. The North Shore project, the work he'd built here, the fact that this job had been the most professionally significant thing in his career. But he said it because it was the honest option on the table, and it needed to be acknowledged. I'm not saying I want to, but it's an option. I don't want you to do that. Her voice was immediate. I'm not going to let... She stopped, took a breath. I'm not going to let him push you out of a job you've earned because it's convenient for his argument. Then what? I don't know yet. I need to think. A pause. I need to talk to the company's legal counsel, and I need to do it before Preston's version of this gets any further traction. Okay? Landon. Her voice shifted. I need you to hear something. I'm listening. When I was sitting across from him today, hearing him talk, she paused, as if organizing it. I kept thinking about the puzzle, the soggy puzzle pieces, Maisie and the tape. A brief silence. I kept thinking about the soup your neighbor made, about the drawings on your wall, about plate tectonics, apparently. He heard something catch in her voice. Brief, controlled, released. He was sitting there telling me I'd made a judgment error, and all I could think about was how completely certain I am that I didn't. Landon sat in the dark and held the phone and felt something move through him that was large and quiet and did not have a clean name. Good, he said finally. Good? She said. Yeah. He thought about how to say the rest of it and decided the plain version was the right version. Because you didn't. The week that followed was the hardest stretch they'd had. Not because of a single dramatic event, but because of the sustained pressure of it. The board situation, the professional questions, Preston's presence in the city as a background fact. Victoria was in meetings Landon wasn't privy to. Claire was managing things Landon only partially understood. He went to work each day and did his job, which was the only concrete thing he could do, and tried not to read the situation as larger than it was, he told Dana. He called her on a Wednesday evening, Maisie asleep, sitting on the balcony in the cold because he needed the air. Dana listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. This guy is trying to blow up your job, she said. He's using my job as leverage against her company. That's worse. A pause. Are you okay? I'm dealing with it. That's not what I asked. He looked out at the dark street. I'm scared, he said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, and it felt accurate and uncomfortable. Not of losing the job, exactly, of the whole thing of what this costs her. If it costs her something she worked for, I won't forgive myself for that. Landon, Dana's voice was careful. Did she ask you to protect her from the cost? He didn't answer immediately. No, he said. Then maybe let her carry her own weight here. He sat with that. She's not a project you're managing, Dana said, not unkindly. She's a person who's handled hard things before you showed up. You walking down that aisle didn't make her someone who needs rescuing. It started something. That's different. He stayed on the balcony for a while after he hung up, in the cold, thinking about the difference between starting something and saving someone. The board meeting happened on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after Preston's return. Landon was not there. He was at his desk at the Bridgeside office, doing work that needed to get done regardless of anything else, which was what he'd been doing all week. Victoria texted him at 3:14. Done. Call you when I'm out. She called at 4:45. Hartwell backed down, she said. Her voice was different. Not light, not easy, but settled in the way things settle after something difficult has been resolved by being moved through rather than around. Meade abstained. The rest of the board confirmed full confidence. Landon exhaled slowly. What did you say to them? I laid out the conflict of interest policy as written, which you do not fall under by any existing definition. I had legal there to confirm that. I addressed the optics question directly. I didn't hide from it. I told them that I was in a relationship with someone who worked at this company, that I was aware of the appearance it created, and that I would put in writing any agreement they needed about recusal from decisions directly involving your work. A pause. And then I told them that if the question on the table was whether my personal judgment was compromised, they were welcome to evaluate that against the last 3 quarters of revenue. Landon sat back in his chair. How did Hartwell take that? Quietly, which is how Hartwell takes things he can't argue with. And Preston. Preston has no formal relationship with this company. He never did. He gave some opinions to some board members, and those board members chose to raise them. Now they've been raised and addressed, and that's the end of his involvement. Her voice was flat and final, in a way that meant she had closed that door and was not returning to it. He's also leaving Pittsburgh. I heard from a mutual acquaintance this morning. He's going back to wherever the strategic fit takes him. Landon looked at the window with the broken blind. Are you okay? He asked. I'm tired. A pause. But not the bad kind. There's a good kind? The kind after something's been dealt with, yes. He heard her moving, footsteps, the particular echo of her office. I want to come over tonight. Yeah, come over. Maisie's going to be there. I know. She's going to want to tell you about the Farallon plate in more detail than you asked for. A sound that was close to a laugh. I'm genuinely looking forward to it. She came at 6:30 with food that wasn't planned and a tiredness in her face that she didn't try to hide. Maisie hugged her at the door with the physical certainty of a child who has never had occasion to doubt her welcome. Victoria held on a beat longer than usual. Landon watched them from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. They ate dinner, and Maisie did, in fact, provide additional information about the Farallon plate. Victoria asked follow-up questions with genuine interest, and Landon watched his daughter's face light up in the specific way it did when she felt heard, and thought about how that expression was one of the most important things in his life, and how he had not expected it to include this woman, and how strange and right it was that it did. After Maisie went to bed, they sat together in the quiet of the apartment, not talking about the board meeting or Preston or any of the week's accumulated weight, just sitting together in the particular comfort of a shared silence that had nothing to prove. Victoria was leaning against him, which had become the natural configuration, her back against his arm around her, neither of them making anything of it because it had stopped needing to be made anything of. I want to say something to you, she said. Okay. Preston told me the meeting was to apologize, and part of it was, she paused, but I think the other part was to see if I'd crack. If 6 months of actually choosing something had made me uncertain enough that he could create a fault line. She turned her head slightly so she could see his face. I wasn't uncertain. He looked at her. I was angry, she said. I was tired, but I wasn't uncertain. A pause. I wanted you to know that. Landon looked at her for a moment, at the lines of tiredness around her eyes and the steadiness underneath them. At the woman who had stood alone at the front of a church 4 months ago and had not been saved by anyone, who had, in the end, turned and walked toward something she'd chosen. I know, he said. She held his gaze, then she turned back and leaned against him again, and outside the city went on with its evening, and inside the apartment on Morrow Street the radiator clicked, and the broken blind in the third-floor window let in a thin bar of streetlight, and the Triceratops drawing was still on the wall where Maisie had put it, and everything that had been uncertain was still somewhat uncertain, and everything that mattered was, for this moment, in this room. Spring came to Pittsburgh the way it usually did, reluctantly, in stages, with cold mornings that still smelled like winter hanging on even when the afternoons finally softened. By May, the trees on Morrow Street had their leaves back, and the light was different in the apartment, longer and lower in the evenings, coming through the third-floor window at an angle that made even the broken blind look intentional. Landon noticed things like that more than he used to. He wasn't sure when it had started, the noticing. Maybe it had always been there, the architect's habit of reading spaces, reading light, but it felt sharper now, more deliberate, like something in him had decided that the ordinary details of his life were worth paying attention to. He was 33 years old. He had a daughter who was 7 and had recently decided that in addition to paleontology, she was interested in structural engineering, prompted entirely by watching him work at the drafting table one Saturday morning and asking, very seriously, why buildings didn't fall down. He had a job that had grown into something more significant than he'd planned for. The North Shore project was in its final phase, and the firm's principal architect had told him, in the blunt and slightly awkward way that men of that generation delivered good news, that there would be a conversation about partnership when the phase concluded. He had a woman he loved, which was a fact he'd been living with for months, and had said out loud exactly once, in the kitchen of the Morrow Street apartment at 11:15 on a Tuesday night in March, quietly and without rehearsal, and which she had received with the particular stillness she got when something landed with full weight. She had said it back. Not immediately. There was a pause that he thought, briefly, had gone wrong. But then she said it, and it came out in a way that made clear she'd been carrying it for a while and had just been waiting to be sure it was the right moment, which was so entirely Victoria that he'd almost smiled. He almost smiled thinking about it now. The question of the wedding came up the way most real questions came up between them. Not from a proposal, not from a plan, but from an ordinary conversation that turned a corner neither of them had anticipated. They were at Cora's restaurant, the Filipino place in Bloomfield, which had become their place in the specific sense that it was the location of their first real conversation and the location of approximately one lunch a month since, and Cora herself had started bringing out food before they ordered because she knew what they liked. It was late May. The windows were open for the first time that year. Victoria was talking about a partnership offer her company had received from a firm in Seattle. A good offer, strategically sound, that would require her to be on the West Coast more than she'd been previously. "How much more?" Landon said. "Potentially 1 week a month. Maybe 2, during the integration phase." She watched him. "Say what you're thinking." "I'm thinking 2 weeks a month is a lot." "It is. And Maisie asks about you when you're gone for 3 days, so 2 weeks is—" "I know." She turned her fork over. "I haven't decided yet. I'm weighing it." A pause. "I told them I needed to consider some personal factors before I could give them an answer." He looked at her. "You told a business partner you had personal factors." "I told them I had considerations that required time. They don't need the details." She met his eyes. "But I want to be honest with you about what the considerations are. One of them is the Seattle question. Another one is—" She stopped, set her fork down. "Say it," he said. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded look she reserved for things she'd decided to stop managing. "I want to know what we're building. I want to know if we're building the same thing. Because if we are, then the Seattle question has a different set of answers than if we're not." The restaurant was quiet around them. Cora was somewhere in the back. At another table, 2 women were sharing something and laughing about it. "What do you think we're building?" he said. "I think we're building a life." She said it plainly, without theater. "I think we've been building it for months without calling it that. I think Maisie is part of it, and the apartment is part of it, and the fact that I know which drawer your neighbor keeps the good soup bowls in is part of it." She held his gaze. "I think we should get married. Actually married legally, on purpose, with full information about who we both are." A beat. "That's what I think." Landon looked at her for a moment across the table at Cora's restaurant, with the window open and the afternoon light coming in and the sound of the city doing what it always did outside. And he thought about a morning a year and a half ago when he'd ironed a blue shirt to attend his employer's wedding and had not remotely anticipated this outcome. "I've been thinking the same thing for about 3 months, he said. Victoria looked at him. "And you didn't say anything? You're not easy to propose to. You're intimidating." "You've told me I'm not intimidating." "In general. In this specific context, you are." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her face, that surprised laugh quality Claire had described in the hallway after the board meeting. "Are you telling me I intimidated you out of proposing to me?" "For about 3 months, yes." "Landon, I know." She shook her head, but she was close to laughing now and not hiding it well. "We're a disaster." "We're functional," he said. "Mostly." She reached across the table and took his hand, which she did sometimes now without preamble, just as a thing that happened. "Yes," she said. "I haven't asked yet. I'm preemptively answering. That's not how this works. I make the rules. You really do," he said, and turned his hand over and held hers. And Cora came out from the kitchen with something they hadn't ordered and set it down and looked at their hands and said, in the particular way that Cora said things, "Finally," and went back to the kitchen. He did ask, formally, 2 weeks later, not in a restaurant or at a rooftop or with any arrangement that required advanced coordination. He asked in the apartment on Morrow Street on a Sunday afternoon, while Maisie was at Donna's for the afternoon, and the apartment was quiet, and Victoria was sitting cross-legged on the couch reading something on her tablet. And he was in the kitchen making coffee, and he thought, now, just now. No staging. He came and sat on the coffee table across from her. She looked up. He had a ring. He'd spent 3 weeks looking for it. Not at the places you were supposed to look, not at the stores with the particular lighting and the velvet displays, but at a small estate jewelry shop on Penn Avenue run by a man named Gerald, who had been doing this for 40 years and who, when Landon had described what he was looking for, not showy, not about size, something that looked like it had a history, something that suited a person who was exact rather than excessive, had disappeared into the back room for 20 minutes and come back with something that was right without Landon being able to immediately articulate why. It was a 1940s setting, platinum, with a single oval stone that caught light differently from different angles. Not enormous. Not performing. Right. He held it. Victoria looked at it and then at him. "I've been in love with you since before the church," he said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't the moment that started it. The moment was just the first time I stopped pretending I wasn't." He paused. "I'm not a perfect person. I've got a complicated job and a modest apartment and a 7-year-old who is going to have a lot of opinions about this. I can't promise you easy, but I can promise you real." He looked at her directly. "I want to build this with you, officially, on paper, the whole thing." Victoria looked at the ring and then at him for a moment that was longer than comfortable and shorter than it felt. "The apartment's not modest," she said. "It has character." "Victoria." "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't quite dry. "Obviously, yes. I said yes 3 weeks ago at Cora's." That was preemptive. "This is confirmatory." She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. Gerald had asked for her ring size through a method involving Claire and a piece of string that Landon had not asked too many questions about. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. "It's exactly right," she said. "Gerald found it. Tell Gerald he has excellent judgment. He said the same about you, and he's never met you." She laughed, the surprise kind. He sat next to her on the couch, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the quiet apartment for a while without saying much, which had become, over the past year and a half, one of their shared languages. Maisie found out when she came home from Donna's at 5. She walked in, registered their faces, looked at Victoria's hand with the speed of a child who noticed everything, and said, "Is that a ring?" "It is," Victoria said. Maisie looked at her father. "Did you ask her?" "I did." "Did she say yes?" "She did." Maisie processed this for approximately 3 seconds with the focused seriousness she applied to all significant information. Then she said, "So she's going to be my mom, my real mom." The room was very quiet. "If you want that," Victoria said carefully and gently. "That's up to you, Maisie. You don't have to call me—" "I already call you Mom sometimes," Maisie said. "By accident. I know. I want to do it on purpose now." She looked at Victoria with 7-year-old directness that had no performance in it at all, just the pure statement of what she wanted. "Is that okay?" Victoria's voice was steady when she answered. "It's more than okay." Maisie nodded, satisfied, like a decision had been made and confirmed and filed. Then she said, "Can we have pizza tonight to celebrate?" "Yes," Landon said. "With the garlic bread?" "With the garlic bread." She went to her room to put down her backpack, already moving on to the next thing in the way of children who have received what they needed and don't require the moment to be extended further. Landon looked at Victoria, who was looking at the hallway where Maisie had disappeared, and whose face was doing several things at once, none of which she was trying to control. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades, the way you touch someone when you want them to know you're there without making them perform a reaction. She took one breath. Then she reached up and covered his hand with hers. They told Donna that evening, across the hall. She looked at the ring and then at Landon and said, "I knew before you did." He didn't argue with this because it was probably true. They told Dana on a video call the following weekend. Dana cried, which she denied, and asked to see the ring, and told Victoria that Landon had spent 3 years being too stubborn to be happy, and she was genuinely relieved he'd finally gotten out of his own way. Victoria said she could relate to that, and Dana laughed in the particular way of a person who has just found their people. The wedding planning was, in keeping with everything else about them, largely absent of drama because they were both people who had enough experience with drama to actively choose against it. No venue with a waiting list, no centerpiece meetings, no guest list that reflected anyone's social obligations rather than actual relationships. They picked a garden in Frick Park, a stretch of it that Landon had walked through enough times to know exactly what the light did on an October afternoon, which was the same month it had all started and which felt right in a way that neither of them over-explained. 60 people. The people who were actually in their lives rather than the people who needed to be seen at events. Claire, who had threatened in her exact, precise way that she would be at this wedding, or she would find a way to make Landon's professional existence significantly more complicated. Cora from the restaurant, who didn't come to things like this usually, but who had said, when Victoria asked, "Of course I'm coming," in a tone that suggested there had never been a question. Donna, who started crying when she was invited and said nothing intelligible for approximately 45 seconds. Dana and her husband, flying in from Cleveland. Sophie, Victoria's college roommate from the original disastrous wedding, who said when she heard, "I was there for the first one. You can't keep me from the real one." Victoria's team from work, not the whole company, just the people she'd worked alongside for years, who had watched her build something through difficulty and deserved to see this. A handful of Landon's colleagues from the firm, including the principal architect who shook Landon's hand when he heard and said, "Good man," in the way he said everything, which was as economically as possible. And Maisie, obviously. Maisie, who had decided she wanted to be the flower girl and the ring bearer simultaneously, which Landon had gently explained was logistically challenging, and who had compromised by agreeing to walk with the rings and then distribute flowers from her basket on the way back down the aisle after the ceremony, which was frankly more creative a solution than the conventional arrangement. The morning of October 14th, exactly 1 year after the original day, a choice that was deliberate and that they discussed and agreed was not about reclaiming something, but about marking it. Landon woke up before his alarm. He lay in the dark of the bedroom on Morrow Street and listened to the apartment. The radiator wasn't clicking yet. Outside, the street was quiet in the particular way of early morning. He could hear Maisie's sound machine through the wall. He took stock, not nervous in the way he'd expected to be. He'd expected some version of the anxiety that came with significant decisions, the checking and rechecking. What he felt instead was something quieter, a settled awareness, like standing in a building you've worked on for a long time and recognizing for the first time that the structure is sound. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with it in the early morning and looked at Maisie's drawings on the wall. More of them now, an expanding gallery that had migrated from the hallway into the kitchen and up the side of the refrigerator. Dinosaurs still, but also rockets now, and one portrait that was unmistakably Victoria, rendered in orange crayon, with very long hair and what appeared to be a crown. He looked at that one for a while. Maisie came out at 7:15, which was late for her, wearing her regular pajamas rather than the orange ones, which had finally been retired after extensive service. She looked at him at the kitchen table and said, "Today's the day. Today's the day." She climbed onto her chair. "Are you nervous?" "Not really." She considered him carefully. "You should eat breakfast before weddings, so you don't get hungry during the ceremony and have to think about food instead of paying attention." "That's good advice." "I read it somewhere." She looked at the Stegosaurus, which was sitting on the table. "Is Victoria nervous?" "I don't know yet." "She probably isn't," Maisie said, with the confidence of a 7-year-old who had decided long ago what Victoria Sterling was made of. "She doesn't get nervous. She just gets quiet." He looked at his daughter. "When did you figure that out?" "A while ago." She said it simply, like it was obvious, and reached for her glass. "Can we have pancakes?" He made pancakes. Victoria texted at 8:45. "How are you?" He wrote back, "Good." Maisie says you don't get nervous, you just get quiet. A pause. Then, "That child is terrifyingly perceptive. I've been saying this for years. How is she this morning?" She ate 2 pancakes and gave a detailed briefing on the logistical plan for her flower distribution strategy. A longer pause. Then, "I love her so much, it's slightly alarming." He looked at that text for a moment and felt the thing in his chest that had become familiar and had not become smaller with familiarity. "She loves you back," he wrote. In case that needed saying. "It always needs saying," Victoria wrote back. "See you at 4. The ceremony started at 4:15 when the October light was doing exactly what Landon had known it would do. Low and golden through the trees, the kind of light that made everything look like it was being seen for the last time and the first time simultaneously. The park was quiet except for them. 60 people arranged in chairs on the grass. Cora in the 3rd row looking more emotional than she'd probably intended. Claire, in the second row, with her exact posture and something that was definitely not tears in her eyes. Donna in the front row with an actual handkerchief, prepared, organized even in her grief. Dana gripping her husband's arm and already past the point of denial. Maisie stood at the front with Landon, holding the ring box with the focus of a person who understood the weight of the responsibility and was not going to drop it. She was wearing a dress she'd approved herself, dark orange, obviously, and her hair was in 2 braids that Landon had attempted and Donna had corrected. She looked up at him while they waited. "You look nice, Daddy." "You look nice too, Bug." "I know," she said, not with vanity, just with the calm self-possession of a child who had been told the truth and believed it. Victoria came through the garden path at 4:17. She was wearing a dress that was not white. Ivory last time had been someone else's idea of what she was supposed to look like, and she'd spent enough of her life managing other people's ideas. This was a deep champagne silk, simple and long, with her hair down and a few pieces pinned back, and she looked like herself, which was the point. She was walking alone. Her mother had died years ago, her father long before that, and she had thought about this, who walked beside her, who gave her away, and had decided in the end that the answer was nobody, because she wasn't being given. She was arriving. There was a difference. She walked toward Landon through the October light, and he watched her come and felt the 1.5 years of everything that had brought them here. The church, the coffee shop, the soup, the puzzle, the board meeting, the ordinary Tuesdays, the hard conversations, the silences that had meant more than words. And he thought, this is what it looks like. Not the fantasy version, the real version. Imperfect and specific and built from actual material by actual people who had stumbled through it together and arrived here anyway. Maisie, standing beside him, watched Victoria walk toward them and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "There she is." There she was. The officiant, not the same man from the church, but a woman named Ruth, who Victoria's therapist had recommended and who turned out to be the best kind of person for this kind of work. Warm without being saccharine, precise without being cold. Began speaking. She talked about choice, about the difference between things that happen to you and things you build with the material of what happened to you. She talked about the kind of love that doesn't arrive as a feeling but develops as a practice. The daily decision to show up, to be honest, to hold someone's weight and let them hold yours. Landon listened to all of it and found it was true. They had written their own vows, which had been, in the weeks leading up to this, the single most difficult part of the entire process. Victoria had 3 drafts that she'd shown Claire and then rewritten entirely. Landon had started twice and stopped, and on the 3rd attempt had written something that was shorter than he'd planned and more honest than he'd intended, and which felt, when he read it back, like the actual thing rather than a version of it. He went first. "You told me once that the worst day of your life led you to something you didn't expect. I think about that differently now than I did then. Because the worst days I've had, and I've had some, didn't lead me anywhere I was ready for either. You don't get to the real things through the easy doors. You get there because you stayed when you could have left, and because you chose when you could have waited, and because you told the truth when the comfortable version was available." He looked at her. "I want to do this with you for the rest of my life. The staying, the choosing, the truth-telling, all of it, even the hard parts, especially the hard parts." A pause. "And I want to do it right here, in this city, with this kid, in the apartment, with the broken blind and your ring on your hand and Cora's soup in the refrigerator." He heard something that might have been a sound from Cora in the 3rd row. "That's my whole thing. You're my whole thing." Victoria looked at him for a moment before she spoke. She was holding herself steady in the way he knew, now, that she did. Not suppressing, just organizing. "I spent a long time being very good at the version of my life that looked correct," she said. "The right partner, the right events, the right answers. I was excellent at it, and I was also, underneath it, very lonely in a way I didn't examine, because examining it would have required admitting that the correct version wasn't working." She paused. "You didn't rescue me from that. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I rescued myself. But you showed me, very specifically, what it looked like to be present without an agenda. To show up not because it was strategically sound, but because it was the right thing. and I had not seen that in a long time. She glanced briefly at Maisie, then back at him. I love your daughter. I love that she named her Stegosaurus after a geological era and keeps it on her shelf in chronological order, and that she decided to love me before I'd done anything to deserve it. I love that she is exactly like you in the ways that matter, and completely herself in every other way. She looked at him steadily. I choose this. You, her, the apartment, the broken blind, all of it. Not because of what you did in that church, but because of who you are every day after it. That's who I'm marrying. Ruth said the words. They exchanged the rings. Maisie's hands were very steady. She'd been practicing, she'd told him, with the ring box for a week, and Landon believed it. He put Victoria's ring on her finger next to the estate ring from Gerald's shop. She put his on, which was a plain platinum band he'd picked himself and which fit exactly right. Ruth said, You may now— Finally, Cora said from the third row, clearly. The 60 people in the chairs laughed. Victoria laughed. The surprised kind, the real kind. Landon laughed. Maisie looked at the assembled guests with deep satisfaction, like she had personally arranged this outcome. He kissed his wife. Maisie said, Ew, which was obligatory, and then immediately reached up and took Victoria's free hand, which was the part that mattered. They walked back down the path together, the three of them, through the October light, while 60 people who had been specifically chosen for being real stood and made noise. Donna was completely gone. Claire was holding it together through main force of will. Dana had stopped pretending. The reception was in the garden too, strung with lights as the sun went down, catered by a team that Cora had personally overseen and which featured, among other things, her lentil soup, because Victoria had asked for it and Cora had said, Of course, it's your wedding, in the tone of a woman who had always known this was where it was going. Landon ate food. He danced, not at the appropriate moments, not at the times when dancing was expected, but at the moments when the music was right and Maisie pulled him onto the makeshift dance floor and left him no option, and at the moment when Victoria appeared beside him and said, without preamble, Dance with me. And he did. She was not a trained dancer. He was not a trained dancer. They were two people who had found their rhythm through a completely different process, and it turned out that the rhythm carried over, and they moved together on the grass under the lights, with the city visible beyond the tree line and their daughter dancing nearby with Donna, who was a surprisingly good dancer for someone who had been crying for the past 2 hours. At some point in the evening, Landon found himself standing slightly apart, holding a drink he wasn't drinking, watching the scene. Victoria talking with Sophie, gesturing about something, the specific animation in her face that he'd come to understand was her genuine enthusiasm surfacing without the governor she put on it professionally. Maisie, with her shoes off, flower basket abandoned, running across the grass with the determined energy of a 7-year-old who had decided bedtime was a concept that didn't apply tonight. Claire and Dana talking in a corner, which was mildly alarming from a logistical standpoint. Those were two people who did not need to compare notes. Cora accepting compliments about the food with the modesty of a person who knew exactly how good it was. All of it ordinary, all of it real, all of it his. He thought about the morning a year and a half ago. The blue shirt, the ironing board, the plan to appear and leave before the open bar became a problem. He thought about sitting in the back row of a church with a woman in a yellow hat and an old man asleep in the aisle, waiting for a ceremony that had already stopped being the ceremony it was supposed to be. He thought about the specific, non-negotiable discomfort of watching someone stand alone in front of 400 people, and the moment when sitting still had stopped being possible. He hadn't known then what he was walking toward. He'd just known he was walking. That was probably the truth of it, he thought. Not that the worst days led you somewhere good. They didn't always. And he didn't believe in that kind of arithmetic. But that you could choose, in the middle of a bad moment, to be something other than a spectator. To move, to offer what you had, which might not be much, which might be just an arm and a presence, and the refusal to let someone stand alone, and to trust that the rest would follow from that, or it wouldn't. But either way, you'd done the thing. The rest had followed. Victoria appeared beside him. She followed his gaze across the garden to where Maisie had cornered Sophie and appeared to be giving her a comprehensive briefing on something, from the gestures, probably dinosaur-related. She's explaining the Jurassic period to Sophie, Victoria said. Is Sophie surviving? Sophie has a doctorate. She's handling it. A pause. Although Sophie keeps nodding at the wrong moments, which is going to cause a problem when Maisie gets to the part that requires actual retention. Landon looked at his wife, at the champagne dress and the October light and the ring on her hand, at the woman who had texted him a photo of a building once and asked if it was structurally interesting or structurally terrifying, and who had eaten lentil soup on his couch with her coat still on because she wasn't sure yet if she was staying, and who had held a soggy puzzle piece up to the light and decided it could be fixed. "Hey," he said. She looked at him. "Are you glad?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment, the direct, full-attention look that he'd been the recipient of more times than he could count, and which never became ordinary, not exactly, though it had become familiar. "Deeply," she said. "You?" "Yeah," he said. "Deeply." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they watched their daughter explain the Cretaceous extinction to a doctoral graduate who was nodding at the wrong moments, and the lights above the garden made everything amber, and somewhere behind them Donna and Dana had found each other and were definitely comparing notes, and the city did what the city always did, and inside the particular circle of what they'd built, imperfect, specific, real, everything was, for this moment and the next, and the ones after that, enough. More than enough. Exactly right. Preston Grant sent a brief email in November. No subject line. 3 sentences. He said he'd heard they'd married, and he wished them well, sincerely, and that he was sorry for the way things had gone, and that he hoped they were happy. Victoria read it at her desk on a Wednesday morning, then showed it to Landon that evening. He read it, set his phone down. "Are you going to respond?" he asked. "I already did," she said. 2 words. "What 2 words?" "We are." He looked at her. She picked up her coffee mug. "I think that covers it." He agreed that it did. Maisie turned 8 in December and asked for 2 things. A new dinosaur for her collection, specifically an Ankylosaurus that she had identified by catalog number from a Natural History Museum gift shop website, and for Victoria to be at her birthday dinner, which she specified should be at Cora's restaurant, because Cora's food was the best food and birthday dinners should have best food. Both requests were honored. They sat at the table in the back at Cora's, the same table where Landon and Victoria had talked for 2 hours the first time they'd come here together, the table by the window, the one that caught the afternoon light. Maisie sat between them with the new Ankylosaurus in front of her on the table, upright, facing outward, already part of the collection, already named. "What did you name him?" Landon asked. Maisie considered. "Gerald," she said. Landon and Victoria looked at each other. "Good name," Victoria said. Cora came out with the food. Maisie immediately began telling her about the Ankylosaurus's defensive capabilities, which Cora listened to with every appearance of genuine interest. The restaurant smelled like the things it always smelled like. Outside, December was doing what December did. Landon looked at his daughter and his wife at the table in the place that had become theirs, and felt the ordinary completeness of it. Not the absence of difficulty, not the promise of smooth water ahead, but the solid, specific presence of a life that had been chosen rather than fallen into. Built from the materials at hand rather than the materials that were supposed to be available. There would be hard things ahead. There were always hard things ahead. Maisie would grow and change and require things he didn't yet know how to give her. The company would produce new pressures and new challenges for Victoria that would spill into their evenings and their weekends and require navigation. His career would move through phases that were not all going to feel like the North Shore Project, not all going to feel like moving forward. They would disagree. They would get things wrong. They would have the kind of nights that left them tired in ways sleep didn't fix, and mornings where the weight of everything felt more present than the light. That was the deal. That was the actual thing. Not the version of it that looked good in the telling. But they'd already done the hard parts. They'd looked at the hard parts directly, both of them, and they'd chosen anyway. That mattered. That was the material the rest of it was built on. Maisie was explaining something to Cora. Victoria was watching her with the expression Landon had first seen on his couch, when Maisie had said a word by accident that she was now saying on purpose. Landon sat with his coffee in the restaurant on the December afternoon and thought, this is what it was for. Not the dramatic moment in the church, though that had been the beginning, the crack in the careful arrangement he'd built around himself. The first step down an aisle he hadn't planned to walk. Not the headlines or the video or the 100,000 ways the world had tried to tell the story of what happened. Those were just the surface of it. The actual thing was here. The lentil soup and the soggy puzzle piece and the floor-to-ceiling drawings of dinosaurs in a child's room organized by geological period. The broken blind and the clicking radiator, and Donna's notes on the counter with the blue pen stars. The woman who had stood alone in a white dress and then decided, deliberately and over time, to stand somewhere else. The man who had gotten up from the back row and walked toward something without knowing where it went. The family at the table in Cora's restaurant in December, with the new Ankylosaurus standing guard, and 8 years of Maisie, making the whole room brighter, and all of it ordinary, and all of it everything.